Just the
And the only difference really is we have different gateway notifications.
That's a much better. So we have to find I think Thursday.
Thursday, if so lunch, hopefully.
One no capability, one capability.
I love the red box. Even has a little flip.
Yeah, tomorrow. Tomorrow at
4:20.
or after the tours.
Yeah, I can do that. Eventually, I will have
You're gonna find right out
to.
what a better term back is compatible. This is what it means to be back.
So we're actually at the point where we're supposed to be starting, I think. Unless I had the time wrong. But I think everyone is still getting cookies, so we'll give everyone a minute or two.
They ran out of cookies about 10 minutes ago.
So are the complaints already on the list? That's right. Andy, you talked too long.
Here?
Yeah.
Cool.
I did not say hi. I could see the name tag. It took me. I had flashes.
Okay, is Clyde here? Oh, actually, hold on. Mahesh is going to present his costs. Where's Mahesh? Is he here?
He's right there.
Okay. Should we wait? Or, I mean, we're 2 minutes past.
I think we should relax for 2 minutes.
Does anyone know the other blue sheet is?
We're going to try to get going. If folks would take their seats. Do we know where the blue sheets are? Do we have both of them? There's a blue sheet hiding back there.
Oh, no, he did it.
So apparently we should not have taken a break because we've lost about half the room. It's only Monday.
It's like a third of the room.
All right, the diehards are here.
Okay.
So formally, since we're a new session, we have the new note well. After that, we're jumping right into the presentation. Mahesh? Whoops, what number is this?
Yeah, we could start officially now. All right, so I'm going to talk about the QoS Yang module. Next slide, please. All right, so to say the least, we had a lot of issues trying to get any kind of agreement around the model that we did present about in '94. And people told me I was anywhere between too smart or too foolish to try to attempt to define this model. So we'll do our best, but so give us a little bit of leeway in trying to come up with the perfect model. The other problem we had with the first model that we presented around DIFSER was that, of course, it didn't take into account any of the L2 parameters. So trying to just define DIFSER pretty much ruled out any L2, whether it was MAC address or VLAN or any ether type matching capability. So we had to go back to basics to try to figure out how to incorporate that. So we started to look at it as Lego building blocks with people with red hats trying to figure out what's the base model and then how to build on top of it. So I do need to say that this draft will replace the Netmod DIFSER model that we presented. Next slide, please. So I'm going to try to do something different. Rather than cram the slides with tree diagrams and enough words that I know you'll not read anyway, I'm going to try to define for you what our thought process was in trying to come up with this model. And hope that you go look at the draft and tell us if the thought process was right or not. So going back to the Lego building block model, we looked at a base set of pieces of models that we needed defined for whether it was L2 or L3 services. So we came up with 4 such blocks. First one is, of course, the classifier. This is where traffic coming into the network gets classified whether on different filter types. For example, it could be DSCP, source IP, dest IP, or protocol. Then we needed to, of course, define an action associated with the traffic. So everything related to marking, metering, dropping got clubbed into the action module. Now, policy is what we define as the thing that brings the two together. So it binds the classifier and the action. Okay. And finally, in the target, of course, is where the actual application of the policy gets applied and the augmentation of the interface and the collection of statistics as associated with that particular policy. Next slide, please. So this is where diffserv now comes in. So where the base model kind of lays the framework, diffserv is where we have kind of the first implementation of the model. So it goes ahead and augments all these different base set of models, augments classifier, augments policy, which has reference to action, and then it also augments the target. And that's how we define the diffserv model. Next slide, please. So now, does that mean that we have completely defined a diffserv model? Apparently, it turns out that there are very different implementations and from one vendor to another as it relates to queuing or advanced queue management. So we said, okay, since that cannot be normalized in any fashion, we will make that vendor specific. So there is the intent was to have multiple vendor examples, but before the meeting, we couldn't quite agree on vendor B example. So what we had was a vendor A example, which was Cisco's example. We're still waiting for example from Juniper and other vendors. So as soon as we have in the next revision, we hope to have a vendor B example in the draft. But for now, look in the draft, look at the vendor example. That essentially is this ultimate set of what Cisco's implementation might look like, or Cisco's definition of the submodel will look like. So that's pretty much what I had. Any questions?
Kent as a contributor. So do I understand correct that this document replaces the diffserv document from the 03 diffserv document from before?
That's correct.
Okay, I'm just looking at the authors list. I'm noticing that it's a subset of the authors from before.
Right. So the authors from Juniper, we were going back and forth trying to agree on the model, and before we could not quite agree on the set of models, and so the idea is to include them, at least Juniper-wise. The other contributors, we're still waiting for word from them. We tried to include them.
That's right. It wasn't just Juniper, it was Huawei and Sienna as well.
Yeah,
But
so
the idea is to bring them all back.
them back in when we get participation from them and actual comment on the model.
Okay, thanks.
Can you elaborate on the reason for the rename?
Right. So as I said in the original slide, when we had originally defined it was the diffserv model, and it pretty much excluded anything that was L2 related and
Anything that was layer 2?
L2.
But it's still a diffserv specific model.
So what having the base set of models being the QoS, which can include both L2 and L3 parameters, allows it to be used for both L2 services as well as L3.
But does it cover all QoS cases?
Yeah, the idea is.
So if I want to put, let's for instance, say TE underneath it, it's covered? Because that's another way of providing QoS?
Yes, I
You,
do.
you think so? Under this same model?
Not under okay, so
It's okay. It's great if it does. I'm just surprised. I read it. I must have completely missed that, but.
So the idea is that it should be extensible to other QoS, whether it is L2 or L2 plus.
Okay, I think I read it and still think it seemed very diffserv centric. And so I think I have a little concerns with the name change, and I would have preferred just to have the diffserv model cover all the uses of diffserv.
Okay.
So I'm a little worried about the name down the road, but it's okay. It's still 00, you did a reset there. So there's more time for discussion.
Dan Bogdanovich, with regards to, the naming, we had the discussion, about having a generic QoS model. The biggest problem between the two vendors that were participating is the significant difference in the general QoS implementation in the hardware. And coming, to a common abstraction was, a pretty hard exercise. So, from that perspective, it makes sense to, provide a full QoS because diffserv alone is not sufficient. So the point is that there should be more than two vendors represented, at the design team and have more active participation, from that perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Benoit Claes. A different point on the policy, right? We have SUPA, which is about policy, right? They have a Yang model. So what we have in the charter of SUPA is that SUPA will be a success whenever what they define as policy construct will be reused in different Yang models, right? So since you're starting pretty much from scratch again, have you looked at SUPA and what they're doing for policy?
I have to admit I am not, but maybe that's something that we can take as an action item.
With regards to SUPA, at least from the last meeting, I don't know if they did some changes. SUPA would be too high level because here you have to first define, the queue, then the actions, and essentially the matching conditions. And then once you create those basic QoS elements, then you will decide how you want to stitch them together in different maps. And policies going on top that are how you're using the maps. The class maps.
So there is no way to extend what SUPA is doing for your need. This is the conclusion.
At this moment, I'm just I'm not an author, but I'm just a contributor to that draft. And right now, as far as I know, no.
Okay, fine, that's a fair conclusion. Can you do me a favor and mention that to SUPA and the reason why?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Shifeng Liu from Maxim. There's a QoS EM model draft in RTGWG working group. So wondering if you have a
Sorry, in
compared
which working group?
RTGWG.
In the routing working group. Okay.
So yeah, just wondering if I checked the differences and the common.
All right.
Yeah, so it would be really good to see, to take that, look at the work that's going on elsewhere and see if it makes sense to sort of synchronize between them. I think we're out of time on this.
Okay.
So we're going back to our regular schedule. We did a little bit of a shift to accommodate Mahesh's schedule. Can we go now to Clyde? Is Clyde in the room? Syslog? Does somebody want to present Syslog? Well, do we do it for him or do we just see if he comes back? We lost him at the break. It's remote.
Oh, he's.
Oh, here he is. Thank you.
I think you just dropped.
Oh, I dropped him.
Press it again. So, sorry, Clyde, can you come back?
I didn't see that you did it. Sorry.
No, actually, I didn't. It was must have installed here from before. Okay, here it comes.
Hi, there we are.
Okay, great. Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Okay, next slide. So I'm presenting this on the behalf of Karen Srinivasa and myself. We had a significant review by Martin and Tom Petch, and the result was the 07 update, where we attempted to achieve greater module clarity through better descriptions, references to RFCs, and we added a when clause, a pattern clause. We added an example on how to add vendor-specific facilities, which had been an issue on the list before. Martin helped us refactor the terminal and the session containers for greater clarity and simplification. And we added TLS support. We updated the Netmod working group chairs. Welcome, Lou. And we translated the draft text into XML format so that it looks much more professional. And so that's essentially, we addressed all of Martin's comments and most of Tom's comments. Tom had one comment that started a kind of mini debate on the list, which is it better to have a complete implementation with features, or is it better to have a core implementation which could be augmented by vendors? When we started out, our first Yang doctor was Bert Winan, and he led us down the feature path, which is what we have now. There are 10 features, and so that's the way it is. I don't know if we want to continue the discussion on the Netmod list about, whether we should be using features, where the trade-off is between features and core functionality. Next slide. And so we published the models to the GitHub repo, and I included a link which shows the diffs between the version 6 and version 7 draft. And that's it.
Any questions?
Kent Watson as a contributor. So is there a desire to extend this to support TLS? We
did support TLS.
The current draft supports
So
it?
It's in this draft. What we didn't do is to specify data elements associated with key exchange. Remember, we had a brief offline discussion about that. And,
Yes.
and so what we did was a high-level reference to TLS with a reference to the syslog over TLS draft as part of the remote case.
Okay, so I think we might need to look at the solution then for that.
Yeah.
Lou Burgers, what do you think is left to do on the draft? What actions do you still have?
I have only one minor action, which was Benoit asked us to make a minor change to the example so that it doesn't trigger an issue with the extraction.
We talked about that earlier, right?
Right.
Okay.
And
fine.
so, yeah.
So once you make that change, the authors think that the document is ready, is done. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So it sounds like we're one rev away from potentially last calling this document. It would be really good if folks can take a look at it and send comments they might have to the list, particularly those that had previously comment. If you can double check that you feel your comments have been fully addressed, that's really important. So if,
Thank you.
I'm not sure any of the ones who commented are in the room, but maybe they'll hear this and take that action. So actually, I can ask the authors this. Authors, have you received any explicit acknowledgement from those who have reviewed it and provided comments?
I haven't. Well, we received a follow-on conversation from Tom about this issue of features. I did not receive any additional comments from Martin.
Okay, if you can just ask him explicitly, I know he's listening, but if you can explicitly ask him if his comments are addressed and do that on the list, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Okay, next presentation, AC.
No, it's not mine.
Oh, so is it?
Model classification.
Let's go. Oh, we skipped it. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Operator.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. So, hi, this is, I'm presenting on behalf of Benoit Claes and Carl Moberg, the Young Model Classification Draft. And since Yokohama, we did some additional work, and the Open Config group has posted a Young Catalog draft, which is, very interesting, from our perspective. Next slide, please. So first of all, my apologies. We missed the window and we posted it this morning, so I'm not sure if anybody had a chance to read the updated version, but there wasn't many differences from the last posted draft, and I will just go through those on the next slide, please. So what we are having, in the draft is that we are having two dimensions for the classification. One is the layer dimension. We can have it either be as a network element or a network service, and each one of those models can be essentially defined by the second dimension, which can be either, essentially standard, vendor-specific, or a vendor-specific extension. The base of all the models is the vendor-specific, and then you're building, on top of those. Next slide, please. So what we changed, from the 0.0 version, we, were adding, some. Essentially we added some text about adding models, to the catalog. And we also, looked into the work of the Open Config, the Open Config catalog authors and their, actually to their work, the draft. And we saw that some of our classification could be useful in, in that by adding, essentially 2 leaves into their catalog, which would be, then provide the categorization of the model.
Jason Stern. The third model type there, vendor-specific extension. I guess I'm just a bit curious why we use the term extension versus augmentation. Is it almost purely the concept augmentations, or is it because we can add more identities? I guess you want a more general term.
It's also, just one more identities you have. For example, in match actions, you can have multiple identities that not everybody is supporting.
Okay.
Next slide, please. So we were suggesting this, but then also there is a question what the OpenConfig authors had in mind with their category and subcategory leaves, inside their, in the module catalog, because they are saying, essentially in there that base identity for the module category is expected that the published organization will define additional derived identities to describe their categorization schema. So if we don't know what was the exact intention of the authors, and unfortunately they're not here, this will be posted also on the mailing list for them to answer if these 2 essentially fields can be merged, or they had some other ideas, for those fields. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm already in the example, so I'll skip on that. Wait. So on the, sorry.
I feel like a puppet.
So with them, the idea was that if you can do that categorization, according to our draft and ask them, to support it, then here would be an example how to do, an L2 VPN service, catalog entry. And essentially, I have reduced, the full metadata because it would have been, for that just too big on the screen. And I just essentially added there the 2 proposed leaves that we are adding to it, that it will then allow the classification, according to our draft. With having all those benefits, we believe that it would lead to faster adoption of, essentially the faster adoption of by the industry of the young models, as well as, searching for existing models, and it would be easier because today you have to run over multiple catalog sources when you're, trying to find them, and then there is no easy way to find out what exactly the model represents unless you read some kind of a description, if there is some or something, or something similar. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then, yeah, so the question would be, please read the draft, provide some comments, and also take a look at the OpenConfig catalog draft, because there is, some overlap that could be useful, between our work and their work.
Any other questions?
Ask about if it's ready for last call. So how much more is there to be done before we do last call on this?
So from our perspective, unless we receive any comments and if people agree, on our, on our proposed categorization, we think we are ready to go to the, working group last call. How many people have read the draft? Well, it's the latest one has just loaded, but the main thing is about the, the 2-dimensional categorization, and how many people agree with that, proposal.
How many people agree, and we have 1 person agreeing?
Yeah.
How many people disagree? No
Okay,
one.
100% support.
Jason Stern. I think it's reasonable and helps, like, it'll help discussions. I think it's something we'll probably have to kind of let sit and soak as people start to get used to it and start to use it. Like, it's kind of like when you talked about how, something isn't proven until it's implemented a bit. So I'm not sure if it's one we want to necessarily rush to nail down, but it may be one that people start using and populating the catalog, and then as it starts getting used a bit, we'll have a feeling that, okay, yeah, it was kind of useful and right.
Yeah.
But the point is, you have to agree on those names,
Yeah.
so that we are talking about the.
Yeah, so I don't know how to give it kind of, okay, here's the status, but we're going to hold off from RFCing it or whatever, but.
Benoit Claes is a contributor to that document. There are two things in that document. First of all, at the terminology. You know, whenever we speak with different SDOs, it's clearer to say this is a service model. Okay, fine, etc. There is the catalog part now, which is new, and somehow there is a dependency on what's going to happen with this open config catalog, right? Yeah. Because what we're proposing is to add a couple of fields in there. Like, okay, if I search right now, I can have an L3 VPN, I could have two models. They're called L3 VPN, but one is a service one is not a service one. So we need that field somewhere.
And you really have, yeah, the differentiation between, and then also is the dependencies, you know, you can then easier find out dependency between the models.
So maybe the action item is to ask the open config guys what they plan to do with their draft.
I asked, right, I did ask that on the list.
Yeah.
And they said that they've just been busy doing other things and they plan to come back and talk more about it.
Right. And they send me an updated version. So they're working on this.
Okay. So you know more than the list. Great. That's appropriate for the AD. So what do you think about going even deeper and adding more categories? Is that something that you think is worth thinking about? Like, I'll even give you a hypothetical. So let's say you want to classify, I don't know, types of OEM models. Would you do that?
So I spoke in the last couple of years with multiple customers, and I tried even separating service models into two categories and into two layers, as well as the device model into two layers. And the reply from them was, it is too complicated. They want you, to keep it simplified.
And we had the open config guys who came in with a very detailed structured model that they want to impact at the path level, as opposed to, this type of approach, which doesn't impact the path.
Yeah, but they are giving a lot of metadata, but when you're doing the categorization, I haven't, in the classification, I wasn't as far. I was looking for the model, which is an element model and which is a service model. They have all the other information. Yeah. So, but having this, just because the idea for the Young classification draft here was to specify which, is it a service or is it an element model? And then based on that, you will know which dependencies can be between those models.
So I'm asking this question so that people have this draft in mind when AC talks.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So now you're ACL.
Next. ACL? ACL, yeah.
Just give me one moment.
Jason, you ready?
This is the other ACL, not me.
No, but sorry, okay. So here, it was a design team, originally Juniper, Cisco, Brocade, and we took over a draft that was proposed by Cisco. Right now, we went through a last call. Next slide, please. So, we went through a last call and we received, a lot of comments from Martin Björklund, Jochen, and just to repeat, our intention was to provide essentially minimum core functionalities that are, fairly common across, multiple implementations, on vendors, because some vendors had more than one implementation of the ACL. So based on that, minimum model, we will be able to agree on, that can be implemented with minimum changes, across multiple vendors. Next slide, please. So one of the big changes that we did, we moved to Young 1.1, because the Young 1.1 is coming, and there was an agreement that all the new models that after Young 1 will be approved will be coming into, will be Young 1. There will be a requirement for that. We cleaned, a bunch of example outputs. Jürgen was, sorry, I meant, I switched, mixed up. Jürgen was complaining of some of the design at the end, and about the modularity of the design. We didn't hear from other people on that one, and because we were already, at the last call, and if other people have no comment, they have no complaints about the current, the model's design. We would like to leave it that way. So this is the leaf input interface. This is something that Jason had, some, comments, and we have cleaned up, some example outputs because there was a bunch of copy-paste errors. Next slide, please. And essentially, this is the question that Jason feels pretty strongly about. It's about matching on an input interface. And the question is that should we add support for that in the basic model, or should be that provided as a vendor-specific or extension? Now, I know that Juniper supports that. Nokia does not support that. From the other vendors, if there are some people, one or the other, I'm happy with both ways. It's a working group call. Which way you want to go? You want to have the support for matching input interface, or you don't want to have it?
Jason Stern here. So the way it's kind of presented here makes it look like a Juniper versus Nokia battle. So I guess my thinking was on the base model that we have a bunch of matching on packet parameters. And then there's this one kind of other item, which is metadata kind of sticking out there like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
And okay, yeah, it so happens that I work for Nokia, we don't have that. But I also just feel it's not part of the base functionality of ACLs.
Yeah, well, so
it's this metadata part. Let's make a whole metadata extension model, just like, Elliot's got an extension for host names and everything else. I just don't think it belongs in the base model. And just to complete that, I know you mentioned you thought that iOS XR supports it. They do not. Brocade does not support it. So I think there's quite a number of implementations that don't support it as a base ACL functionality. But I don't think it belongs in the base model myself.
So Jeff has my question to you, Jason. So by example, standard C sock adder type behavior you see out of Unix.
Jeff, can you speak into the mic a little bit? I can't really hear you.
It's been around. So the standard Stevens book type stuff does offer that as an option. That's one of the reasons why this tends to pop up. I agree with you. It's not supported on every platform. Would you be okay with this being a feature?
Well, I did kind of put that in the mailing list that I'll relent on a feature, but I honestly don't believe it belongs in the base. And Dan was trying to avoid features in the base model, so I don't think it has that much support broadly. For the applications we're talking about, the primary applications, the data path ACLs across the vendors, it's not a common feature. So I think what we have in the model, which is probably more important, is that the way you showed we extend interfaces to point to an ACL. That's by far the most common way that interfaces and ACLs are associated.
So do you want to make a call to the working group which way they want to go?
The first thing I was going to ask actually was, what other items do you have open?
This is the last open item. All the other items are closed.
All right, so why don't we try to gauge the opinion of the room. Kent just mentioned doing humming, and I'm going to mention I don't like hums because I can't hear in this type of environment. So
I'm sorry to take the mic, and thank you for the opportunity. This is
name.
Elliot Beer. I just want to put a pin on one thing. When we talk about the MUD draft, there is one issue that I came across, and it does relate exactly to something that I think the ACL model is correctly doing, but I just want to mention it up front as we're going through this step, which is the MUD model needs, or the implementers essentially need to determine whether an ACL is applied to an input interface or an output interface, and this needs to be described somewhere in the MUD file server, and that is some form of metadata as well. And I just want to highlight, I think you guys made the right decision to not include how this interface, whether this is an input access list or an output access list, but there may need to be in other models places where that is specified, whether something is input or output. And as long as we're comfortable with that, I can sit down again and stop taking your time.
Dan may have a response, Jason Stern, Dan may have a response for that, but maybe we could just change the example in the augmentation example, just to show, instead of attaching to an interface, you could show attaching it as input in the interface and output, just to show it could be used as, you could specify a direction where you attach it into the model and do an object or something.
Yeah. Dan, I don't remember, did you provide any examples of how the model could be extended to support?
Yes, it's support.
So
It's
even
you have
for-
examples there.
Also for output actions?
Well, we have we have the example for attachment, and then we have a couple of examples for augmentations.
Does the augmentation example include actions?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't remember that. Okay. So, given that there are those examples of how you might extend already in the document, let's look at whether or not we want to keep match interface basically in the base or as a potential future addition. Well,
the main reason why it was put in there because the ACLs are used for accounting purposes. Many, they are using them just to count traffic, and that was the main reason behind it.
So why don't we, who thinks that the input interface should not be included in the base document?
As a feature or in the case?
In the base? You don't want it? Should not?
I think it should be a feature.
All right, so AC just said, gave us a third option. So, what's that?
We purposely were avoiding a features in the base model.
Yeah. So I'm actually gonna ask the first question I meant to ask before AC called. Who would like to see ACLs not in the document I'm sorry. Interface not in the document at all? Anything, not even mentioned. As a match. So that's very few. Who would like to see it as a feature? That's actually pretty close to the same number. Who would like to see it as required? All right, that is the least number.
Okay.
So
it's even, I will remove it from a document and then.
No, I think we don't, we can't judge consensus here. We can get a feeling for the room. I think the feeling for the room is between take it out or leave it as a feature. I'm going to give you my bias because I'm a chair, so I can do that. I think it's a really important thing to have, but feature sounds better to me than required because there's a lot of people that don't do it also. So, but with that said, we have to take it to the list and have the discussion. So I would like to give the homework assignment to you and ask and say that specifically that in here there was preferences for either taking it out or having it as a feature. What do people feel on the list?
Yep, sounds good. Thank you.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Now it's time for AC.
By the way, we found a bug in Meeting Materials Manager. If you upload a PowerPoint and then try to re-update it, it doesn't update. It doesn't update the PowerPoint. It only updates the PDF.
Ah,
So I've been trying to show the PDF, the PowerPoints here have been failing.
okay. I'll remember that from my work group. Anyway, I'm AC Lindum, and Lada and I have been collaborating on this draft for quite a long time. This is just an update on what we did, and a lot of what we did is related to the next presentation from the routing design team. So I'll go through this rather quickly. Next slide. Okay, the changes. One thing, the IETF routing model was designed to cover a device of different hierarchies, and consequently it had the routing instance in it that was in support of things like, in Cisco we call them bursts, or in Redback Ericsson we used to call them context. Now, if we go with the schema mount approach, you could go with a lower common denominator for a basic device or a device supporting this hierarchy. So this is more aligned with what we're doing
the direction that I hope the Netmod working group is going to go for solutions. And in doing that, we removed routing instance. And another thing, we'd always had, a discussion about whether or not the network discovery protocol, subprotocol, router advertisement belonged in this model. And what we did we kind of made it a separate model so that you have the base, the real core infrastructure and routing separate from this IPv6 protocol. I think I covered everything. Oh, one thing we did, we could even go further in aligning with the router design team, and I'll cover it more in the next discussion. There are some things that we wouldn't need in this. One is the interface list, and we'll talk about that later. The other thing is we have a protocol list here. We have a routing protocol list, which is really needed. The question is are we gonna within a device, there's other types of protocols than routing, other control plane protocols. Do we want to use this list or do we want to use a separate list? And then we run into, if we use this list, we run into the conflict of whether or not what's a routing protocol and what's not a routing protocol. This seems to be, this is another theme that has to do with keychain, but that's Friday's presentation. Next slide. I went through this all right. 4861 is the base specification for network discovery protocol. Okay, we believe once we get some direction on operational state or decide that we're just going to go forward with the base specification, there'll be inevitable updates. Right now, we have it split at the top level. You have config and operational state, and never the two will be mixed. Like I said, the models, I think this is a good, as author of both these two, a co-author on both this and the routing design team, it's good. This is self-contained. It doesn't really depend on, it depends on, IETF types and the interface model, but nothing that's a draft. So this could go forward with that. But on the other hand, if we adopt the stuff that's in the routing design team, the device model, then there's some changes that could be done. Specifically, we wouldn't need the interface list because for a simple device, it's implied that it's all the interfaces. And for a device that has more hierarchy to it, for instance, more logical network elements or network instances, then there's a binding that's done, and I'll talk about that in the next presentation. That's it. I'm done. I think that's the last slide.
Okay, any questions? All right, thank you.
Thanks. I expect there'll be more discussion on this next one.
We still have an extra, I think, 17 minutes in the schedule, so we can have lengthy discussion if necessary.
Okay. Okay, I'm presenting on behalf of the design team. Actually, it's a subset of us that have been really working actively on this device model, and that's Lou, Chris Hops, Dan, and myself. And today I'm just going to give you an update on this device model. We presented it in excruciating detail at, was it Prague or Yokohama?
Prague.
Prague, yes. And these are the updates since that time. Okay, you can look at this. I'll just go right to the first topic. So we really have, one thing we've done in this thing, we've taken some of the detail out of the top level model, which is a structure for all. If you remember, the device model has like a hypothetical, not hypothetical, but an organization for like a carrier class route networking device. It was originally derived from the work done by OpenConfig on their overall device model. And we've taken that and refined it over the last year or so. And one thing we've done in this version is we've taken out some things that are useful from a standards track, and we put them in separate models. That would be the logical network elements and the networking instances. And we believe those should be standard track. Now, we'll get into what we should do with the overall device model. Next slide. So we have these two, and I'm gonna discuss the. Don't worry about that. I'm gonna discuss them in greater detail in the next couple slides. We have these logical network elements and the networking instances. We've went with the assumption that we will have a schema mount solution. Now, if we have a schema mount solution, we can mount any model at the logical network element level. Of course, there's a lot of models that wouldn't be applicable at that level, and what models a given device supports would be specified by the draft. It's a working group document, Netconf. That's the Yang library working group draft. I believe that's the name of it.
Yeah.
I just read it last week, so yeah, that's the one. And for a network instance, this is I'm going to get more into this. This is the thing that's equivalent to a VRF or a virtual switch instance. So you could potentially have, depending on the hierarchy of the carrier class device, you could really have the top level, the device level. Below that, you could have a second level of virtual devices with resources defined. These are the logical network elements. And then below that in the hierarchy, you could have network instances. And these are like your VRFs or your virtual switch instances. In the Redback model, we use the context that could be either level, so it kind of was a collapse. And I know that other implementations have these two levels of hierarchy as well. Okay. So just to review, just before we go on, a logical network element, that is like a virtual router. Now, one thing we did a little bit differently that's changed is the whole idea of management. The default is that the device would be managed from that virtual router, or, like sort of like a tenant. And it would not be manageable from the top level. Of course, but there's a leaf element that specifies whether or not it can be managed from the top down as well. Now, I guess this is a little different from VMs, where once you define a VM, the VM has sole ownership of all the resources and management responsibilities for all the resources that are allocated to it. So at one point in this draft, we had a default logical network element that would manage everything. This time we have a top level and we have this leaf ref. I'm not forgetting anything. So we have network, go on to the next one. So this really hasn't changed. Again, this is just for review. A network instance is like a VRF or a virtual switch interface. Here, when I was talking about IETF routing, in this draft, we have for the interfaces, for the RFC 7223 interfaces that we all know and love. And actually, what's the one for the IP? Is it 7277? I can't remember. But we have a binding for each interface to a logical network element. And for at IP level, we have it to a binding to the network instance. Now, if you had that, IETF routing really wouldn't need a separate list of list of interfaces. because they would be implied by this binding at the logical network element or network instance level. And again, as you remember, I said the current version of the device model, the IETF, routing Yang design team 03 version, we're assuming that we have a schema mount. We have, as Benoit had made it clear to us, it doesn't compile right now. We have to get straight what we need to import and how we need to handle these mount points from schema mount. But we allow mounting of anything inside, mounting both in the logical network element and in the network instance. We have defined mount points. Let's see. Like I said before, it's not expected that all models will be supported. We don't try and specify what models will be supported for mount. That'll be dictated by the Yang library list that the device will return. That's the draft, the working group draft in the NetConf working group. Did I miss anything? No, I think I covered all this. Next slide. So we've simplified this a little. We've taken out a lot of the details. One thing about this device model is it's really hard because it's really spanning over, with the exception of RAID, most of the work in the IETF. So you have to have this structuring to be rather not at too granular a level, because just to get agreement on it, and I'll get more into that. And you can see we've simplified it from the last version. I'm not going to read them. You can go next. Oh,
Yeah,
Dan?
Dan Bogdanovich. So I looked it up, and then I was thinking, why are we putting the IETF keychain, in the top level instead of putting it under system management? Because more or less we are defining, in the top level, mainly the physical properties of it. And, in my opinion, literally the keychain should move into the system management, because filtering, filtering QoS routing interfaces, those are, your basic one, but keychain is, somewhere else, in my opinion. It should go under system management. And this is something we can discuss, but, it just dawned on me.
Would ACL go there too?
Well, ACL is filtering, and it's hardware specific what the hardware supports. Same thing with the QoS. It comes down, to the support of because it's hardware specific.
Okay. Devices have typically put the keychain at the top and allowed them to be used across multiples. Now that might at least across, but but we could talk about that.
So wherever you put ACLs, you should plan to put filters as well that are packet-based or other, same place, same comment. Wherever you put them at the same place, along with keychains, either at the top or in the system management. I'm not as picky, excuse me, not picky, that's not a word, excuse me, Dan, for implying. I'm not personally, I don't care where it goes, but you need to sort of group that stuff together.
Mike, please.
That wherever you put the ACLs,
And names,
put the
please.
So the
filters.
ACLs and
Names, please,
keychain
too.
should be put in the same level?
I think, I believe that ACLs and filters should be in the same level, and that, as Dan suggested.
No, but I was talking about keychains.
You think keychain should go under system management and ACLs should be at the top?
Because ACLs, you have something which is hardware specific. You have ACLs that are hardware specific.
Yes.
So not all the ACLs. So depending on which platform you are, you will have different, you have
Right.
different
And the
properties of the ACL.
Agree. And the same is true of what we're calling filter-based ribs. They have some hardware-specific pieces just like ACL. Or do you think that's wrong? I'm glad to be educated.
Well, I have to think about it, but, I'm trying to reference why you're putting keychains with.
No, my comment was not toward keychain. My comment was toward put the filter-based ribs wherever you put the ACLs. Because they're the same sort of thing.
So, but you're not saying keychain should go in the same place. You're agreeing with Dan or disagreeing?
No, I'm not. I'm on a different topic.
Oh, good. Okay,
I'm on the
okay.
ACL topic,
Okay.
not keychains, ACL topic.
Okay.
Sorry if I was going to say if you wanted to put them both under system management, I am not concerned. I just wanted the ACLs and the filters at the same place. That was my small point.
We can take
Yeah,
that down. You're an officer, so we'll discuss that. I'm actually thinking we should maybe take it out at the top level and put it down as something that's mountable in logical network element myself. I'm referring to the keychain.
Oh, that's fine.
Benoit Claes. So if I summarize this, we have a routing design team with a document which is about to be accepted in routing, which is perfectly fine. However, you're defining a structure there for the entire set of data models for everybody. So the line protocol will need to go in their OEM protocols. The service model will need to go to system management, right? So I believe that we have two different topics here. The routing part, you know better, right? This one is more like, has to be agreed maybe here. So it would be perfectly fine to extract this from your routing document before accepting it in the routing working group. Because this implies a lot of things, right? Whenever we'll discuss with IEEE or BBF or MEF, we're going to say, this is where you should put those model ID. So this is highly important.
If you're reacting to that same topic, go ahead.
So splitting this document up into 2 or 3 different working groups will, be very hard then to keep it consistent. Right now, we can at least come to a common structure in one place, because if you start breaking it up and everybody will start putting it according to their own needs, it will get watered down. And I don't think in this case we'll be able to come up to a common, basic device structure.
Okay, let me put it differently. Did any of you guys went to the line working group telling from now on you have to put all your protocols in the OEM protocols? No. Okay. That's just one example, right?
Eric, is it a separate topic? Is it a new topic? Eric? I'm sorry.
That's Jason.
Jason. I know, it's Jason. I'm
It's a separate
sorry.
topic, so I'll wait. I'll let this one finish up.
We didn't do that, but if you're starting breaking it up, so you will lose a single structure. I don't see how you will have them one governing them all.
So
As as Jeff said.
there's a subtlety here which we haven't got to. I don't remember if it's. I think it's on the next slide, maybe.
Yes.
So we've talked about breaking up the document into 3, where 2 of them are models, which clearly are make sense to continue in the routing working group, the network instance logical network element. But what about this top model 1? When we talked about breaking it apart, and by the way, I'm talking as contributor. When we talked about breaking it apart, we internally said that first one was going to be informational. So it was sort of our perspective in the routing area of what a good structure would be, but it wouldn't have any real impact on anything else unless people wanted to follow it. With a chair hat on, I would like to remark to the group that I'm surprised no one stood up and said, why are we talking about structure here? It was, how do we optimize the structure? So perhaps it's a good thing for the group to talk about having a structure. And now that I'm over here, I'll say, I think that this group's the right place for it, but that's, of course, Jeff, who's the routing working group chair, is saying he wants it, but that's all right. Oh, okay. So I think the question for the group is, do we want a structure or do we not want a structure?
So speaking as a routing working group chair.
What's that?
Are you going to come with formal proposal how we do it? For AC trying to define structures for much wider scope than just routing.
So Benoit speaking. So we heard a little bit earlier the previous session from Rajiv, right? That he wanted to have guidelines, right? Typically, this is a strong guideline that should be somewhere in 6087 bis or somewhere for everybody to look at. If you're going to have a young model, the structure is there. That's what I mean, that it's kind of important. Whether it's one document or... It was not referring to that structure. Why? Because it's not there yet, right? You want to build the first model. But the next question will be where? So if it's one document or two documents, I don't really care. I just want that we agree, at least that Netmod agrees, and not simply the routing design team telling from now on, this is what the industry should be doing.
So can we come up with common proposal how we proceed? I don't want to go to adoption and then you standing up and saying it doesn't make sense, should be done here or there. We really need to decide before we do it.
Speaking from the design, my opinion on the design team, I agree with Dan that we should do all the models, the three, if we break it, when we break it into three, we should do them in the same working group, whether it be Netmod or routing working group.
All right.
My personal preference would be to keep it in routing.
We have a remote presenter.
Hi. Is it working better this time?
Yeah, Chris, it's great.
Okay, Ben,
Yeah, Chris,
I was
great.
going to ask Benoit, would it be enough if we just did what he asked? In other words, can we just keep it in the routing working group or progressing it along there nicely? Would it be enough to go out to the other groups and make sure that they're aware of what we're doing, and do they see a problem with it? I mean, there's not a lot here, right? We're just defining like a common point. And, you know, so would that be enough? And then just to follow up on what Lou said, which is, or we could just chuck the whole thing and everything mounts at the root.
So Chris, one thing informational, would it be informational or not?
I think we've been going with informational because it's just probably would be too hard to force it as a standard, right?
When it was targeted to the routing. When it was targeted to the routing. Oh, we got a bad echo.
Mute me.
Chris. If I mute him, he goes away. If I mute him, he goes away. I'm muting you. Sorry, Chris. You gotta come back. I'm muting you. Sorry, Chris. You got to come back in the queue. Right. So, okay. Our view, and this really dates back to the decision on /device or not. Remember the whole argument about /device? When we lost the /device discussion, we said, fine, this base structure is going to be more informational than required. So we were thinking, or at least I was thinking, that this would be more, that structure would be more informational. Okay. So we broke it into three. Model 2 and 3 would be PS. Model 1 would be informational. I think that it's reasonable. Yes. I think it's reasonable to have the discussion now of maybe it's better to have more structure in this group to see whether the group wants to do it.
So if it's informational, it's just fine.
Right.
It means that it won't be reference from the RFC 6087 bits about the guidelines, right?
Correct.
So fine. I mean, you do what you want then.
So when we start defining things like syslog,
right?
Do we do it at the root, or do we put it underneath? I think that's system management.
That's the right question. Now, if your document is informational, then you say, okay.
No, we say do whatever you want if it's informational. So this is the question. I'm actually trying to ask the opinion of the group. What does the group think? Do we want to have this type of structure? Because if the group wants to have the structure, we should bring it into the group and not make it informational, make it something stronger, make it part of the guidelines. Maybe it's its own guideline document.
So I think we all agree proposed standards is important.
What's that?
You don't want everybody to do something and then come up and figure out it doesn't work. So it has to be a standard. The question where we do it and how we do it.
Okay.
And going with this information doesn't make
so
sense to me.
That's good feedback. So you would like to see it as a required thing or a stronger guideline.
Jeff,
And I'm just going to tell Chris he's got 3 people in queue in front of him.
okay. So 2 comments. I think that Netmod makes sense for this document just for the reason that we are actually talking about something that really has IETF wide perspective on it. RTGWG is not a bad place to do it. You know, routing's, I think, very far ahead of all the other areas at this point in terms of the amount of stuff we're considering. If you want to hold it there just simply because that's where all the discussion's happening today, I don't strongly object, but I think that longer term, it will have to settle in a home that's not just routing. My second comment is, unlike the prior version of this draft, I don't have a strong feeling about whether this is informational versus something that's more normative, just simply because if you're using a schema mount, it's possible to have any of these things basically visible as a top level node and still have a view that gives you the access to the entire thing. I think one of the questions I'd have as a user though is what is the view that we're sort of recommending people to get at the data? So Jason's behind the line here talking about multi-instancing of stuff, having for example syslog as a thing that's okay to be top level, but the minute you start multi-instancing it, it starts changing where you start looking for the data.
Dan Bogdanovich. So from the from the top level perspective, the key thing is that when we are doing the separation, that we have a separation of a management as well of routing. But when I say routing, I mean the layer 2 and layer 3 decision, like the VRFs and the VSIs. So and that you have this instantiation, so you can say I can have multiple logical elements on one physical element, from a full management perspective. So I have like a full management of this device, and then whatever I have underneath that I'm managing, this is fine, because you might decide, oh, from this LNE will be just a switch, but I still want to manage it as a switch, where somebody else can manage the same physical element just as a router, because they will not have any overlapping resources. And then the organization here, I still believe that you have to put into the structure that is hardware dependent, because the hardware defines essentially what you can do. It doesn't matter how you instantiate the features on top of that.
I was going to, Jason Stern. I mean, my view here is that the really critical part of this is to get this idea of a hierarchy of a logical network element and network instance, and being able to mount other things inside there. Like it's that instancing that's critical. I don't think we want to get too bogged down with arguing that the ACL container belongs inside the system management container. Like for non-instancing things, I'm not sure if that taxonomy of the structure of the containers is as critical. What's really important for us though is this idea of being able to put all the stuff inside instances and get that right from the start. So I think that should be the real focus that we try to get agreement on, and I think we're getting pretty close.
I think we have agreement on that.
The LNE and the network instance and mounting, but we don't need to argue if ACL goes inside system management or what containers are within routing.
So you would agree with informational or even maybe never publishing the top level document?
I think we should RFC the LNE and network instance, combining it with the Yang structural mount, and the rest can be information. Stuff that's just containers. Stuff that's just containers. It's not instances. I think that's as important. I don't think that's.
Sorry, I'm causing an echo.
I have to apologize. I brought Chris in because he was going to talk really bad, but you're getting really bad at him.
Yeah, okay, so my point was just to reiterate once again, there's an answer, which is we don't do this structure, right? That is one option, and there are people that are not talking right now that agree with that. There's a few people I know that don't like this structure at all. They think we should just mount all models at the root. So that is one option.
I think one of the people is going to come up and say something right now.
Andy Bierman, I was just going to say I would not get too enamored with a poor man's classification system that this lives under here. I have a clock radio. Does it go under clocks or does it go under radios? If my system falls apart that easily, then I have to rethink its design.
Yeah.
So you're saying don't do this, correct?
I'm saying don't. If you want to put everything that's related to the system underneath system, you're going to end up with a giant tree under system, and I don't see what that helps. So
It helps
so-
that classification problem where people want to be able to immediately or readily view with their model what type it is. So it's another, that's why I brought up the classification, the question of the classification discussion.
I would go with different design approaches that don't rely on the absolute path from root as the classification system.
So you think Model 1 as a PS or a recommendation is a bad
I
idea?
don't think it really matters to the tools where you put it.
Okay.
Classification, and this essentially, you're using classification to specify, the models you have. So this and classification have nothing in common together.
Right now, but they could. All right, so we've taken up extra time here. I think it would be useful to get a little bit of a feeling from the room of whether or not folks think a Model 1 as a recommended guideline is a good idea, or just out there as informational, or headed to Never Never Land is a better idea. So the two options are basically a strong guideline, or just informational that you're free to look at or ignore. Those are the two options.
Lou, can you have the third where we separate what I think is a critical part?
No, this is Model 1. Model 2 and 3 have nothing to do with this discussion. Model 2 and 3 are going to run as proposed standard in whatever group our AD tells us. Right now it's headed to the routing working group.
I'm not positive what you mean by model 2.
Network instance and logical network element.
Okay.
Those are headed for PS. Right now they're headed for the routing working group. If our ADs, get in a wrestling match and tell us to bring it here, we'll bring it here.
Okay, great.
That's for them to make that call. So this is only related to this top level device model. Is it informational, or is it a strong recommendation? I'd like to just get a sense from the room, and then we'll take it from there. So first, who thinks that this is a good thing to be a strong guideline? Hands, please. I would say just a few. Just a few. Okay. Who thinks that informational is the right way to go? All right, that's about the same number. I'm gonna do an audible here.
Jason?
How many think that it should go away?
There was the third option.
All right, how many think it's go away? It's pretty close, maybe a little less, so I think we have, the sense of the room is we're all split. We don't have any, and I'd say, I should ask one more. How many people don't care? Oh, that's almost no one. All right, so we don't have a strong sense of the room.
So it seems like more people care because there's just a question how you want to proceed forward versus who are completely against.
Right, that's fine. Right. So I think that we need some guidance from our AD, because we have two ADs, routing AD, ops AD, as to where we should continue this discussion about the Model 1. Does that not make sense to you? Because we heard the routing working group chairs, they said they would like to have it there. I believe I heard you say you would prefer to have it here.
Benoit, the word to me is less important than the agreement, the solution, right? So if we have both Netmod, routing, and all the people who might be involved into this telling, I agree, this is fine, and whether it's done in routing or Netmod is a secondary question.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of that, but that's okay. This is going to be the last comment because we're really over.
Jeff, on this very brief comment, I think the value of this will only become very apparent to people once examples are actually drawn out of how you multi-instance local schemas, remote schemas, pure mount versus other stuff. Once some of those examples actually show up, I think it will be a lot clearer exactly what you want to do. But until that's happened, I think your discussion is sort of going to fly over people's heads. So you need to have something to drive the conversation.
There's also the practical point of time is if we don't act on this quickly, there's going to be lots of models that aren't paying attention to this, so this whole thing's going to be OBE. I think I have one comment from Jabber that I was ignoring. I'll just read it and then we'll move on. There is value for things. This is from Chris Hops. There is value for things like wildcard paths, hitting things you didn't code for when you wrote your client code. I'm not sure what that relates to. For a common structure, that is. So he thinks the common structure is good, so you can wildcard your client code. So it's a good future-proofing approach. That is his comment. And by the way, he's a guy who's a user. He's on the operator side. So it's notable to hear from the users, not just people building on the vendor side. I think you're out of time.
Okay, let's see if there's anything. Go quickly. Quickly, I talked about this. Okay, this is the last slide. Okay, so we have these open issues, how we use the schema mount, and whether as soon as you mount something, how you if you add to the mounted list, whether that instantiates on the device the LNE or network instance. Of course, alignment with op state requirements and clarification. We've had this discussion about where the policy should go. If it's just an informational model, it's all the rest of these hardware QoS, system management, network services, all these the things after these three, these things don't become as important to resolve if we go with informational or just maintaining the document as a guideline that we never publish because it's too hard to get everybody to agree. That's it.
Thank you.
All right. Great.
Now the real Eric. Sorry, Jason.
I'm going to give an update on something that's going on in the NetConf working group, which is the subscribing to Yang data store push. I'm doing it on behalf of Alex Clem, Alberto, Ambika, and Enar. And so, next slide. Just to give you just a brief start, because we haven't talked about this in this group in a little while. What is the idea of a Yang push? Basically, you want to have a exposure of a subscription interface on a device, and you're able to subscribe to any Yang subtree on the device at any point in that tree. Once you've created the subscription, you can go ahead and push a set of streaming updates to a recipient, and those changes can be as they're made on the device or periodically in the case of operational data. Really, the key here is that it's supposed to be a means of subscription that is independent of whatever a model or source is the source of the data. Next slide. Sorry. Now, I've had the question a couple times, what's the difference between netconf notification or notifications and Yang push? Really, the issue is that when you're doing notifications, it's a publisher-determined set of things that is getting received by the subscriber. So a notification is really analogous to, I know that somebody wants it, so I'm going to push it. And NetConf notifications fall in that realm. It's complementary to the idea of being able to expose a data store and let you to subscribe to items in that data store as you are wanting to. So you can say, I want something in this Yang path in order to get all the items underneath. Very complementary. Now, there's a set of drafts that are going on in the NetConf working group. They include things on both sides of the list. We're only going to focus today on the one that was adopted by the NetConf working group, and that's the Yang push draft. But if you want to see more, come on Thursday to NetConf. Next slide. Now, a lot of the requirements came from the ITORS working group. We reviewed those requirements and the compliance to them previously at various IETFs. There's a lot of interesting requirements for mobile receivers, burst dampening, DDoS protection. Again, if you want to see the requirements, this is just a link to the things that are in the PubSub requirements document in the ITORS. Next slide. Interesting.
Yeah, I don't have the PowerPoint, sorry.
Yeah, it's
Did that
okay.
bug.
This slide is breaking down some of the key elements in the subscription model. And I'm just going to highlight some of the things that are key elements that you should know about if you plan on subscribing. Again, if you want to hear more about it, come to NetConf. Things that are interesting that you really should be thinking about is, for example, filtering. Filtering is one of the very hard parts of subscription because you don't want to get everything that is out there. There are pre-existing filter types that are out there. You can talk 6241 filters. You can talk XPath filters. That is only a subset of the kinds of things you might want to filter. You might someday want stateful filters. You might want to do stuff like mini SQL, like they're doing over in the DDS working group or object management group. So the idea of having an extensible way of adding new filters over time to the subscription is a central part of what we're trying to do. Above and beyond that, some of the things that are new are adding static subscriptions and the ability to add one or more receivers to the subscription. These are a set of things in there that are interesting. Question?
More of a comment. In general, I am very much against putting filters, as you suggested, that on the client side, because such filters are very expensive from a compute resources, and the more the more filter rules you add to them, you might take away from the basic functionality of a device to support your for your push filters, essentially to filter your push content.
Understood. And we have a couple ways we're taking a look at that. First is we have a subscription priority in order to know which subscriptions are more or less important and which ones should be served. Now, you can also identify a certain amount of CPU that you're going to be actually using to serve the subscriptions. There are a number of ways of optimizing what you choose to serve and what you don't. There is trade-offs for knowing what you can actually support or not. Certainly, we've done some looking at the requirements for pushing everything, which is occurring with some telemetry work, where they say send everything off the box and sending a subset of the information off the box. There's a balancing point, and often there's a order of magnitude more expense in sending everything versus doing some internal filtering. And just based on your box that's doing it, there'll be different results.
Let's not discuss this draft here. It is a NetConf working group draft,
Right.
and here we're just providing some information to the working group and the hackathon results. Okay.
Next slide. One of the things we've added since the last go around is we've looked at, really changed the fonts. We've added some requirements coming from the open config telemetry Yang model, and things like that they've added is they wanted to have multiple receivers. They wanted to have DSCP added to the model. So we're getting requirements for multiple places. One of the big sets of requirements they have, which is an open question, is how do we support market requirements for non-IETF technologies? They certainly want Google Protocol Buff, gRPC, Thrift has been mentioned. So I don't really know how to support bindings into transports that are not IETF standard. If anybody has guidance on how to do that, I would love to know, because I just find an interesting...
Let's discuss this at the NetConf working group,
Yep.
please.
Okay, next slide.
So I've talked to Sam Aldrin from Google, his manager. I urge them to bring protobuf and, in general, gRPC
So
specifications
Kent's point is that discussion belongs in NetConf rather than at Mod. So it's not that we don't want to hear the comment, is that we want to hear it in the right working group.
My only point that I'm trying to bring gRPC to IETF.
Okay, bring it to NetConf.
Just an FYI, we had a Yang pushed with an implementation in the Open Daylight that we put in. We extended some of the stuff at the hackathon a couple days ago, and we do create, delete subscription. We're doing on-change subscription, and I'm going to go ahead and show the results of the hackathon again on Thursday if you want to see it. Next slide. And as the working group chairs mentioned, we're going to do a deeper dive on Thursday. This is more informational in order to get people in there. I think it's valid to bring into this because there are open questions of should and what is specific to NetConf, what is specific to Yang, and therefore awareness here is fairly important. All right, thank you.
whether support the configuration change to subscribe the configuration change.
What is the configuration? Missing the question.
Changes.
Oh, yes, yes, you can subscribe to configuration changes and you can filter them. So if a Yang model has configuration, you just subscribe and you can get the on-change push of configuration changes. I'll be happy to even demo that where we change ACL configurations and you get on-change pushes. This is really useful for somebody who's like at a controller and somebody does a CLI change on your device. They'll immediately see that there's a config change going on in the boxes. Having multiple people subscribing to your config gives you pretty much real-time update and visibility without having to continually poll those devices for their current state. This is a big use for the push capability.
All right, thanks, Eric. Shifan?
You can look down. Good. I'm Xifeng Liu from Ericsson, talking about this data model for the configuration scheduling. This is just a grouping for the reusable grouping, which can be used for any model. So the purpose is to specify configuration scheduling. And this grouping was originally introduced in the TE topology model. And so the working group TEs suggests that because it's too generic to be in that model, so we separate out as a separate model. So we present it here. The grouping can be added to any schema node and to specify the configuration scheduling. So whenever the schedule is specified, the corresponding data node will be configured or removed according to the schedule. Next slide.
Sorry, Jason Stern, just a question there. So you have to explicitly add the grouping into your models in order to get the functionality?
Right.
Okay, I'm not sure if you considered an alternative where you can create a schedule where you just point to a list of sub-branches, arbitrary sub-branches to enable and disable. This just seems like you have to kind of add it everywhere in all your data models where you want to use it.
Because the feature is part of this functional component, right? So we don't want to have a centralized calendar services for that. So if you have separate database, that's totally separate approach. I think there's another model I suggested by the Jorgen, and I include here. So that's a separate scheduling database for the measurement purpose, and you can subscribe and get notification from that. But that's a separate thing. So we are talking about for some kind of some component, like let's say TE link, right? So when we implement TE link, we have this scheduler built into that component.
Sorry, Kent, as a contributor, I also, on list, I posted a comment, an expired draft, conditional enablement, yet another approach where this, for doing this, if we want to consider alternative approaches.
Right, thanks for, I got your comment this morning, the email, have got a chance to respond to that. So probably, you want to go over here or we want to?
No, we can just do it on the list.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. And also, you mentioned your previous expired draft. If you had that went further, if the project already available, we don't even need to have to do this again. So, but since we have this situation, we need this, and we need to have somewhere specified.
So that draft did expire, but I mean, I've heard interest over the years that we really should have kept it alive, and especially for the purpose of comments, I'm sorry, not comments, but for enabling and disabling, just for temporary commenting out subtrees is what I'm trying to say.
But for our purpose, we don't want to be that generic.
Correct.
We don't want to do a comment. Yeah. Okay, next slide.
Oops.
So the structure is simple. Basically, we have a grouping with the container list of schedules. Each one of them will specify a start date, duration, and repeat interval. Next slide. So here's an example. So once we specify this schedule to this particular T-link one, so which means that we have this T-link configured weekly for 5 times. Each time is a 1-day period. Next slide. Right, so Jorgen suggested there's another draft in another working group, so which performs some kind of scheduling in correlate. So here's a structure. So you can see we have a whole list of schedules here, and there's a pointer to an event tree. So go to the next slide, please. So that's the event tree, which also covers periods and others. So based on this centralized database, you can subscribe event and take actions. So that's another approach we're talking about Sachs earlier. So compared to that, the LMAP model, which specify this mechanism, the purpose is for the measurement agent, and they can have the schedule and the task executed in the agent, and they have a centralized database for this kind of purpose. For us, we have the schedule specified in place, and we do that whenever the functional component need to implement this feature. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's it. So we welcome any comments, and we'll discuss that further.
Kent, as a contributor, so actually my first comment on the email I sent this morning was regarding motivation for this work. I mean, so the idea is to standardize a grouping that then could be used by many other standard-based modules. Why would we want to do that? I mean, is the desire so that network controllers have a consistent way of scheduling functions for all these different drafts? I mean, is that what you're thinking? But how did you come to wanting to define the solution? Did you actually run into an issue that you were trying to solve, and you decided that this was the solution to it?
When you say complicated?
I mean, did customers approach you and ask you to try to define a common way to do scheduling, or what drove you to want to define a common way to do scheduling?
Yeah, he's pointing at me. As T's working group chair, basically in that group, and from the chair's perspective, it didn't seem to belong in the draft that they were defining it in. They were doing something about topologies or traffic engineering topology, but they wanted to do scheduling, and then they had this mechanism that looked pretty generic. I wasn't the only one who made the comment. I just agreed with the comment that it didn't really belong within this traffic engineering document defining this whole scheduling mechanism. And certainly not everyone who uses that base model wants it, but also it seemed like something that was a generic thing, not specific to the model.
So Jeff Haas, speaking with my ITRS hat. There was discussion in ITRS about doing basically calendared objects as part of our ephemeral state stuff. And one of the design discussions around that was that we don't want the state to just vanish after a given bit of time when you inject it into the ephemeral state, just because you could leave it in some very weird, inconsistent states if you did that. This is a nice mechanism because instead of actually having the protocol inject something that's intended to be ephemeral and live on the calendar, this is simply putting additional information into the configuration that says when it's valid. It doesn't impact whether the information is consistent or not. It just simply says, here's the schema. If it's valid, you can additionally add in constraints as to when it's valid. That adds in additional information. So this is actually satisfying use cases that have been discussed before, in a way that I think actually is a useful thing. I think my only comment would be that the format chosen is nice. You may want to also compare it to the Unix cron type utility in terms of how things can be scheduled there for other types of periods.
Do you have an opinion on working group? As a chair, do you have an opinion on working group?
Where this belongs?
Yep.
I think this is IETF-wide plumbing. I think it belongs here.
Okay. Thank you.
Andy Bierman, so if I put your grouping in my data model, then all sibling nodes and all sibling subtrees are now magically activated or deactivated based on the schedule. This seems, so how does that work with the static model of Yang validation? So I have max entries 1, 2, 3. Does my disabled entry count towards the max elements or not? Okay, so this
actions
You got a mic.
It's
Jeff,
on
can
the
you sit at the
data
mic?
object, not on the schema tree. So the schema tree will remain the same.
Okay, good. This is actually a lot harder problem than it's being presented.
So to repeat my comment for the mic, this is not causing stuff in your running config to appear or disappear. This is the equivalent of a enable node that is programmatic in addition to things. So in terms of your max nodes, you would not be adding or subtracting these things dynamically. They would still have presence. It's only whether or not they're considered active or inactive from a operational state.
Okay.
So let's proceed. What's the?
So it sounds to me that it would be great to see an individual document on this in this working group. Do you agree?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we continue. Okay.
Okay, great. And William, excellent. BBF Yang.
Hi, I'm William Lupton from the Broadband Forum, and I'm just going to give a quick rundown on some of the Yang work we've been doing.
Can you bring the mic up?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's just an overview of the topics. There's just one slide on each of those, and I won't go through them all in too much detail. So just to give some history, we've been doing Yang for about 2 years now. It originally tied to a project we have called FTTDP, or Fiber to Distribution Point, which is sort of a device for which we made the decision 2 years ago to use NetConf on Yang. And so we've been defining all the models associated with that device, mostly so far at the level of access technologies. So we've defined a VDSL model and a G.fast model, and then various other related models. And I won't go through the rest of the detail. So next slide, please. So, I mean, one problem, or I suppose it's a problem, I mean, it's a fact of life, is that the work in the Broadband Forum is done by Broadband Forum members and is not publicly visible. I mean, it's visible once it's published. So currently, we have and so you can get a high-level overview of the work at that web page I've given in the first bullet. But actually, you can also infer some details of what we're doing by looking at Benoit's pages, because he has sort of preferential access, and so he at least can see what all the files are, and so you can get an impression of what we're doing. And indeed, you could get an impression of what we're doing that might overlap with some of what IETF is doing as well. And so, for example, you can see the names of the modules and the submodules, and that's one of the examples. That's the G.fast module. And if you go to the next slide, please, then you can see that this particular module actually has rather a large number of submodules. Sorry, can we go to the next slide, please?
Oh, sorry. So the distraction was that we realized that we've taken and exceeded our discussion time, our slot. So we're going to ask you to go as fast as you're
Okay.
willing.
I'll go very, 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 very fast. Okay, so those are all the files associated with that particular module. You can go and look at Benoit's pages. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, I have to comment on this.
Yes.
I want to note that this slide is labeled visibility.
Well, actually, I was going to say that I would use an extra specially small font as well as going really, really fast. But you can go to the web page to look at the detail. The point is just to give an example of how you can see all the files. And because of the naming conventions, you can work out that most of those are submodules. Okay, the only thing I'll highlight here is that we are creating, or we have, a version of what we call OD360, which is our BBF version of the best current practices. So that's very strongly based on 6020 BIS and 6087 BIS, but we've got some additional stuff in there, and indeed there's more work to do. And so I think that's a model that could apply to many SDOs and organizations that are sort of building what they're doing on the IETF, on the IETF modules. And we absolutely are trying to build on everything we're aware of in use and or augment everything we're aware of in IETF.
Benoit Claes, so previously you wanted to comment on 6087 BIS, but you had no time. Actually, there is a section in there which is specifically for other SDOs, right? So if what you have in OD360 would be valid for other SDOs, it would be perfect to include that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. So that was 6087 you were talking.
67, that's the one about guidelines.
Yeah.
Right.
I think I probably just haven't read the most recent. I need to. Yeah. Okay. So basically, you're saying if there's anything we think should be fed back, we should do that. Yeah.
Right. You should bring it to Andy. Andy talked about that earlier. That might be something that would bring into the document.
Okay. So thereby further delaying the publication of that document. Yeah. Yeah. But okay. Yeah, because we shouldn't sit on stuff. If we think we have good stuff, we shouldn't sit on it. We should share it. Yeah. Okay. So next slide, please. So I guess I've more or less implied this. So the approach we're taking is to use what's there. So we're very heavily dependent on the IETF interfaces. We'd like to use the entity draft. Also, I'm not sure it's being explicitly discussed. I know there's a meeting tomorrow morning. We're also basing some of our current work on the sub-interface ideas of Rob Wilton's drafts. Although currently we're not actually directly using his drafts because there are some aspects in which we can't quite use them in place. So that creates an issue of how we should interact with IETF on issues like that. And then, the second category there, the BBF category, is just some of the other things that we are currently working on or planning on working on very soon, driven by requirements for our device level requirements for this DPU device. Okay, next slide, please. I think I don't need to go through that. That's just a little bit more detail of our current projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so we are using GitHub for developing. We're trying to apply our current processes. So we have these ideas of working texts already, which are the working documents. And so for those that have Yang, we're creating a corresponding repository, private repository with the same name. That's enough on that. And then there's a sort of a corresponding slide for what happens when the development's done and it will be published. This hasn't happened yet, but our plan is that we will publish all of our Yang into a single public repository, which I think will just be called Yang within Broadband Forum. And then it'll be the layout will be at least aware of the layout of the Yang models / Yang repository, and GitHub issues will be available for public comment. We're planning on not making it be completely flat though. We're planning on, we've currently got these 5 categories that, they're not final, but we're thinking of grouping, maybe that's the wrong word, categorizing the Yang into one of those 5. And also to have a few extras actually in the publication directory, the publication directory. We'll also probably upstream them to the Yang models repository, although, we probably will. And we're expecting our first Yang to be published Q3 of this year. And so that's where the working text becomes a technical report. which is our equivalent of an RFC. Next slide, please, which I think is the last one. Oh, and yes, also, I think we really would like to be in a position to release draft Yang. I think that's a big problem that we're not able to currently to share in progress, not publicly share in progress Yang. So we definitely plan to be able to make draft Yang available in a draft area, just like on the Yang models / Yang repository of that same repository, and be able to take comments via GitHub issues before we've we've published it and are tied to backwards compatibility. I think that is the final slide. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you for accelerating. Appreciate it. Any quick questions? We have 10 minutes left for Elliot.
I'd go at your pace, but I don't think I can with this because it's a lot of new material. So I'm here to talk about manufacturer usage descriptions. I'm also going to talk in more detail about this at the OPC WG, so I can accelerate. But I want to focus in on some areas that I'm running into trouble and I need some help. And I'm hoping to get some agreement that this is a cool idea and some participation and collaboration. Next slide, please.
I hate to say this. I'm going to make a comment from that I missed the jabber on the last presentation. So in the last presentation, Balazas made the comment, could you put your module on the IETF GitHub? And if you want to respond on email. I just missed the jabber, sorry.
So next slide, please.
They're in front of you if you want to look down.
Okay, thank you. So there are two drafts that I'm talking about here. I'll work backwards. Draft leader, IETF, Netmod, ACL DNS name. I'll probably be very short about this, which is this is an outcome from a previous discussion on the Netmod mailing list where we didn't want to have DNS names in the ACL model, and everybody agreed that we should do an extension for that if we want one, and so I've done so. Netmod MUD talks about the specific MUD capabilities, which essentially abstract out IP addresses from access lists, which might sound freakish, but wait till you see the rest of this. Next slide, please. Okay, so this has to do with IoT and things. IoT stands for Internet of Threads. And the big problem here is, right? And the big problem here is we have a large number of things, and it's not so much a big a deal in terms of the number of things. What's the really big deal is the number of types of things. In an enterprise context, it's very difficult to profile all the millions of types of things that there are going to be. In fact, we can somewhat estimate the number of things out there, but we can't estimate the number of types of things. I know I've tried, and everybody else has a different definition of what a type of thing is. Next slide, please. So there are two pieces of information the network needs in order to protect you from, or to protect the device. The first thing is we need to know what the device is. And the second thing is we need to know some sort of profile in order to protect it. I'm not going to talk about the first element here. There's lots of ways to identify that stuff, like IEEE 802.1 AR. I'm here to talk more about the second for this presentation. Next slide, please. So we have some constraints and we have some assumptions. The first big constraint is, in my context, in this conversation, I'm worried about the things that have a single function or a small number of functions, which means that they're probably going to have a single or small number of communication forms. Things have very few resources to devote to security. I found out this out painfully when I got into an argument with one of the manufacturers over a grand total of 20 bytes. So another issue or another assumption is that the larger the footprint on the device, the more the threat surface, because there'll be more bugs simply because they're writing code, and most of the manufacturers I'm dealing with don't really know how to write code. So in addition, strong security simply will not be possible because some of these things are absolutely tiny. So the other thing I want to highlight is that the approach that I'm taking is going to scale to millions of deployments. Or at least that's the design goal. If it's successful, if nobody likes the idea, it will scale to 0 deployments. But this means that I'm using a slightly different model for Netmod, and this is one of the things that's really important. The Yang files are not attached to a netconf transaction, right? So the XML generated instantiations are not attached to a netconf transaction. And so you'll see that in a picture in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. In fact, this slide. So the basic goal here is that manufacturers are in a good position to describe their devices and to describe and essentially to describe the network profiles that their devices need. And so that light bulb there on the left is going to basically put out a URI. URI is actually defined in draft Lear IETF Netmod MUD, so that you can see what that's like. The access switch picks it up and it ends up at a MUD controller. It can do this either through a AAA transaction, like through 802.1x, or through DHCP, or through LLDP. Key architectural component here really is the URI, and then the communication path is almost secondary. All right. The MUD controller, which is the thing that eventually gets this thing, it could be a AAA controller or tied to a AAA controller, but it's also a configuration management system, is going to then resolve that URI and retrieve that file using HTTP. Now I want to point out that that access switch that it's eventually going to configure, there could be many different vendor types there. So again, capabilities of the access switch are not understood by the MUD file server. The MUD file server is simply serving out HTTPS, and the MUD file server lives on a manufacturer premises, okay, or is otherwise contracted out to somebody else to provide. Next slide, please. So a file comes back, and that MUD controller then is the guy that's consuming this Yang-based config, right? This is quite a bit different than what you guys are normally dealing with, so I'm definitely looking for deep review here, all right? It then is going to take a Yang file that has essentially the IETF access ACL model, and but with some abstracted stuff out using this MUD model, right? Instantiates something that looks a heck of a lot more, in fact, perhaps identical to the ACL model, and then maybe even communicates back to the access switch using netconf. Key design point here is that you don't want the device in pretty much any of this except for the fact that it's putting out the URI, because it's got no bandwidth to do that, it's got no memory to do that, it's got nothing to do. All right, next slide, please. So, again, this is network configuration information, right? So I'm basically doing access lists at the moment. I don't want to reinvent the wheel, so I've attempted to use as much as possible. So the model that if you look at the drafts, they're really short models, right? There's not a lot here. And again, I'm attempting to scale to both millions of devices and lots of types of devices. And so we need a way to abstract out certain aspects. These are some things that you'll see in the model, one of which is that oftentimes things need to speak to controllers. These might be in the cloud or they might be on-prem, and you need a way to identify those things. Sometimes you want to just limit communication to local. Sometimes you might want to limit communication to a group of manufacturers or one particular manufacturer. And the key thing is you can basically do a replace of manufacturer for IP address if you can register a mapping between manufacturers and IP address as the devices register themselves. There's some additional meta information here I'm tying to the ANIMA work that Max Pritikin, Michael Berenger, and Michael Richardson are doing in terms of figuring out, in terms of trusted device introduction in the networks. Next slide, please. And so, let's see here, what controllers are those? So this goes into some detail in terms of what these guys are actually going to speak to. They might speak to a network management station, or they might speak to a thing controller. They might speak to cloud-based services, again, either local or remote. Next slide, please. Okay, so the MUD draft basically says pretty much what I said. These are the elements that you'll find in there. I didn't do the tree breakdown that everybody else did, but honestly, it's not a tree, it's more a sapling, okay, or a bush or something like that. But there's very little there, and we might want to do more, but I started out small and simple. Next slide, please. Okay, DNS name is, as I said before, it's just an ad. Now both of these things need more review, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. Okay, bunch of open issues. So one of the things that I need to be able to do is handle inbound and outbound access lists. That's not currently covered in the ACL model. And so because this is not, your normal netconf transaction, I might need to add that into the MUD model. And I probably will, and I'm seeking feedback on that. The other point is that because these files are going to be accessed in very large number of cases, if they're hacked, they're going to expose a lot of devices. They'll perform the exact opposite of the goal that I have, which is to secure more devices. The ultimate goal here, right, is to reduce the threat surface of a device dramatically. And so that's what I'm attempting to do. But if the files are hacked, then I'm in trouble. So I need a way to make sure that they don't get hacked. And signing these files becomes important, which was why I was harping on this on the list. So the other point that I'll just raise is that there's also an issue about extensibility. Because I don't have a netconf transaction, I can't do a capabilities exchange. This is something that requires a little bit of consideration. And I've looked at different extensibility models. I've been talking to a few people like Dave Thaler about this. And so right now, the way I'm handling that is simply with a version number in the URI, which is very, very coarse. I think we want to start out that way, but then the next time we bump the version, we also fix extensibility. Okay, next slide, please. So, what is needed? More eyes. Okay, I want to make one point very clear. I'm not a Yang guy. Okay, I need a lot of things here, right? There's a URI, there's a DHCP option, and all this fun stuff. So I've got a lot of components, and I could use a lot of help. I've already talked to Dan Ramascano back there, and he's got some other ideas here which we might be able to merge in, and we might be able to find some commonalities. There are a number of architectural components, and I'm seeking not only eyes on, I'm interested in editors, co-authors, and the like to try and push this forward. So with that, I think I can stop and ask for questions, and I don't know how much time I used, but I did speak fast.
We're about 1 minute over, but.
Okay.
So just a short question.
Just use this mic over here.
Previously we have discussed some options for the schema mount. So you mentioned that you are not working in the context of any management protocol. And one option for the schema construction was that the client has to go for further data under some mount point. So probably that might be a problem for you if you want to use some models that use this schema mount, so that you probably need the schema to be as one bunch that you can really construct it without any interaction with anything.
So thank you for the question. I think the key point here is that we will need to specify exactly which schema are to be used for this purpose, and only those schemas will be used for this purpose. So I do have a question, which is, do people find this interesting? Do they find it comprehensible? Because I did go pretty quickly, but it's hopefully a pretty simple idea because I'm a pretty simple guy. And I really do need feedback, and I really do need help. And I appreciate Dan, sitting down with me today, and I hope other people will too. And if you'd like to get together here,